The heat that afternoon lay heavy over Copper Creek, pressing the dust flat into the street until it clung to boots and skirts alike. The sun was a burnished coin, sinking slow behind the livery, and its light caught on the grid in the air, turning it to gold. People lingered in the shadows of porches, hats tilted, their eyes drawn toward the figure moving steadily down the boardwalk. Clara Belle Wade's shadow stretched far ahead of her, long and unwavering. At 6 feet and 3 inches, she could not slip quietly through town. She had never been able to. Her father used to say she was built like the cottonwoods, tall enough to catch every storm and stubborn enough not to break. But the storms in Copper Creek weren't weather. They were whispers. They began before she reached the mercantile. Threads of sound she'd learned to braid into a single rope of meaning. Too big for a woman. Not right for dancing. No man wants to crane his neck at the altar. She kept her gaze level, hands clasped before her, bonnet shading her freckled face. Every step seemed to land in someone else's judgment. Inside the general store, the air was cooler, scented faintly with dried apples and kerosene. Martha Crowley looked up from the counter, her eyes flicking, always flicking, from Clara's face to her broad shoulders to the width of her hands. The measuring was silent, but not subtle. Clara asked for flour and a tin of coffee, coins sliding from her palm onto the counter. "You're working your father's forge still?" Martha's voice carried the brightness of a question meant to find fault. "I am," Clara said. Martha's mouth pinched, as if forging iron and shoeing horses were acts of defiance rather than labor. She wrapped the parcels in brown paper, set them down without ceremony, and moved on to the next customer before Clara had turned away. The forge waited at the far end of town, a squat building with soot-breathed walls and a door that groaned in the frame. Her father's tools hung where he'd left them, the hammers worn smooth by decades of use. She kept the place alive out of habit and hunger, the steady ring of metal, on metal her only company most days. That afternoon she had just coaxed the coals to a white-hot glow when a wagon will clatter to a halt outside. The sound was urgent enough to draw her to the doorway, where heat from the forge met the sun's blaze head-on. A chestnut mare stood blowing softly, dust on her flanks. Beside her, a man in a weathered hat held the reins. He was broad but not heavy, his face carved with the lines of someone who worked more land than he spoke of. One eye narrowed against the light, but the other, an amber shade deepened by years under the sky, rested squarely on her. "Miss Wade," he said, tipping the brim, "wheels cracked. Heard you might fix it." She stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw the jagged split in the oak rim. "I can." His name was Elias Boone, she remembered now. Widow, kept to himself on a spread beyond the ridge. She had seen him in town only a handful of times in the last year. He unhitched the wheel, and without glancing at her height or the reach of her arms, he passed it over. The weight was nothing to her, but most men still felt the need to remark on it. Elias only said, "Take what time you need," and moved to stroke the mare's neck while she worked. The forge filled with the rhythm of the mallet, the hiss of steam when she quenched the iron. Outside, boots shifted occasionally on the boardwalk, but he didn't speak again until she brought the wheel back. "Good work," he said simply, handing over payment without counting it into her palm. "Appreciate it." She nodded, and for a moment neither moved. The air between them wasn't charged exactly, but it was level, even. She was not being weighed and found wanting. Elias replaced the wheel, mounted up, and with a click of his tongue had the mare turning toward the road out of town. Dust rose behind them, blurring the line where earth met sky. Clara watched until they were gone, the coin still warm in her hand. She told herself it was nothing, just a man needing a repair. Yet later, as the forge's embers dimmed and the street outside cooled into shadow, she found herself listening for hoofbeats that did not come. A week passed before Clara saw Elias Boone again. Morning light slid low through the clouds, silvering the dew on the grass, when the sound of boots on the forge's step drew her from the anvil. He stood in the doorway, a wooden hinge in one hand, his hat dripping from an early ride. "Gate gave out," he said. "Figured you might mend it better than I could patch it." She took the hinge, noting the worn edges, the deep gouge where the pin had failed. His hands were callous in the way of men who worked without asking for help. Most in Copper Creek were like that, Pride first, practicality second. But Elias carried no pride in the offering. By the time she finished, the rain had eased. He lingered, leaning against the post as though the forge's warmth was a thing worth waiting for. When she brought the hinge back, he took it without inspection. "You drink coffee?" he asked. She hesitated, unsure if it was a question or an invitation. He set his tin mug on the workbench, the dark liquid still steaming. "Had plenty left," he said, as if it were nothing, though it was everything. Sharing the same cup without ceremony, she sipped, the metal cool against her lip, the coffee bitter and strong. When she rode out later that day to return the mug, the Boone ranch unfolded in long green swells. Fences stitched the hills together, and cattle dotted the pasture like slow-moving stones. She found him in the corral with a calf that refused to be penned, its thin body darting just beyond his reach. "Bring it this way," she called, circling wide. The calf tried to break past, but she moved quick, blocking its path with an outstretched arm. Elias swung the gate shut with a quiet click, and the calf stilled. He gave her a nod, just that, but it felt heavier than a paragraph of praise. In town the next morning, the air in Martha Crowley's store was thick with cinnamon and speculation. Clara stepped in for flour and found every voice dropping to a hush. Martha, arranging jars on a shelf, spoke without looking. "Boone's been keeping you busy." "I've done some work for him," Clara said. A customer near the stove snorted. "Work, is it? Guess he's tired of living alone." Heat climbed her neck. She kept her eyes on the counter, paid for her goods, and walked out under the weight of their stares. By the time she reached the forge, her jaw ached from holding it shut. She resolved not to ride out to the Boone place again. The town's words had a way of sticking, even when you told yourself they were nothing but wind. The next morning, frost glazed the grass, turning the earth brittle underfoot. Clara stepped out to feed the forge and saw something on the fence post. A pair of gloves, dark leather, the stitching clean and tight. They were large, but made with care, the fingers long enough to fit her own. No note, no explanation. Only the faint warmth of having been handled not long before. She slid one on. The leather was supple, the lining soft against her skin. They fit as if they'd been measured for her. For a moment, she stood there in the cold, looking toward the road that wound out of town and over the ridge to Boone's land. Work filled the day as it always did, mending shoes, sharpening blades, but a glove stayed on the bench beside her tools, drawing her eye more often than the clock. She thought of the tin cup, of coffee still warm when it reached her hands, of the nod in the corral. Small things, unremarkable to anyone else. To her, they were a language she had never been taught, one without jeers or conditions. That evening, the wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of rain. She banked the forge and stood in the doorway, the gloves in her hands. The road lay empty, but she found herself wondering how far sound might carry over those hills if a man were to call her name. Thunder rolled in before the light had fully faded, low and restless, like a drumbeat under the skin of the earth. Clara stood at the forge door, watching clouds muscle their way over the ridge, the wind lifting her hair from her neck. Somewhere to the south, lightning split the sky into jagged pieces. She had just stepped inside when the pounding of hooves came hard and fast along the street. A boy barely old enough to ride skidded to a stop, his pony lathered white. "North fences down at Boone's," he shouted, breath sharp. "Cattle's running. Storm will drive 'em clear into the gulch." Clara didn't think. She grabbed her coat, swung into her saddle, and rode toward the dark line of hills. Rain came in hard needles, stinging her face, flattening her hair beneath the bonnet. The mare's hooves sucked at the mud, each try to fight, but she pressed on, the scent of wet earth rising like steam. When she reached the north pasture, the storm was a living thing. Wind roaring through grass, rain blinding in sheets. Elias was there, his shirt plastered to his back, driving a steer toward the half-toppled fence. He glanced up, surprise flashing before it was swallowed by necessity. "Take the ridge side," he called, voice carried ragged by the wind. She wheeled her horse uphill, cutting off 2 cows before they could bolt into the dark. Her arms ached from the rope's pull. Her boots sank ankle-deep when she dismounted to drag a post upright. Elias joined her, bracing it with his shoulder while she hammered it into place. Their breath coming in hard, wet bursts. A flash lit the world white. Then the ground shook with a rumble of something heavier than thunder. Out of the curtain of rain, a bull broke free, head low, eyes wild. It charged, straight at the man beside her. Clara didn't think about her size, or how the town saw her. She stepped in front of him, ropes swinging in a wide, deliberate arc. The crack of it split the rain's roar. The bull veered, shuddering past so close she felt the heat of its breath. For a moment time slowed. The world reduced to the rasp of her breathing. The rain tracking cold lines down her temples, and Elias's gaze fixed on her. Not at her height, not at her strength. At her. They finished the fence in silence, hands raw, clothes heavy as stone. The cattle huddled in the lee of the ridge, steam rising from their flanks. When at last the storm began to ease, Elias reached for her hand. His palm was warm despite the cold, fingers firm around hers. Not in thanks, not in debt, just in holding. By the time they rode back, dawn was pushing a pale edge into clouds. Copper Creek stirred with rumor before they even reached the main street. People gathered in knots, their voices following like bursts, questions, disbelief. The reshaping of last night into something that could be passed along with shake of the head. 2 days later, the church bell rang. Clara stepped inside to find the pews full, the air thick with the scent of pine and press wool. She could feel the weight of every eye, waiting to see if the stories were true. Elias stood at the front, hat in his hands. When she reached him, he looked only at her. The preacher's words were simple, but when the question came, Elias's voice did not waver. I will. The murmur in the room swelled and broke against the clapboard walls, but Clara heard none of it. Her chest felt full, almost aching, as though something long caged had stretched its wings. Outside, the sky had cleared, leaving the earth fresh-washed and smelling of rain. She stood on the steps beside Elias, the towns on behind them, the open road ahead. For the first time in years, the whispers did not matter. And yet, somewhere deep, she knew the truest part would still come.